Bonjour à tous, goedemiddag and good afternoon, everybody. I am pleased to welcome today Philipp Heimberger. Philipp is economist at Vienna University of Economics and Business. His research focuses on macroeconomics, public economics, and international economics. He has a PhD in economics, and he has worked on macroeconomic divergence and structural change in the European Union, macroeconomics of effect of fiscal policy, and problem of estimating potential output. And it's a pleasure to welcome him today. And Philipp, you have the floor, and you have a big presentation, a very interesting presentation. La place est pour vous.
So thanks a lot for the kind introduction and also for having me today. So let me try to share my slides. It worked before. Hopefully it will also work now. Can you see them?
Yes.
Very good. So I hope it's going to be interesting because, there's a lot of competition as we speak. In about an hour, the German government will present its coalition treaty with the new traffic light coalition. And I guess we will then also know more in terms of what's possible from the German side in this debate over possibly reforming the EU's fiscal rules. So there's now this window of opportunity given that the European Commission has relaunched the governance review process. So what I will talk about today is why some of the technical stuff in the existing framework is politically so important, and why it is something that we should also very much focus on in this debate over reforming the EU's fiscal rules. So we'll mostly talk about output gap estimates and how they kind of are important in the fiscal rules and try to think about what that means for fiscal policy also in Belgium and beyond. Let me start with this, which I took from the latest Belgian draft budgetary plan, which was submitted to the European Commission in October this year. And what you can see here is that, the forecast is that already in 2022, so next year, there will be no slack in the Belgian economy, meaning there is an estimate of an output gap that is virtually zero. And this is important because, as we will see today, this also means that actually all of the fiscal deficit next year will be due to structural factors. So the structural fiscal deficit is estimated to be nearly as large as the headline fiscal deficit. And that will mean when the fiscal rules are reintroduced in 2023, that also fiscal consolidation pressures will be higher. And I will talk about some of the nitty-gritty technical details and why that is politically so relevant. So the key questions that I will pose is, from my perspective, what are some of the key problems with fiscal governance in Europe today? What are the implications for fiscal policy in Belgium and beyond? And then also, what are options for implementing reforms to deliver improvements under given political constraints? And some of the core arguments that I want to advance are that from where I stand, I think that there have been misestimations of what's structural about the fiscal balance systematically already before the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has, for many countries, meant that there was a bias of fiscal policy towards overly restrictive fiscal policy. And these problems will re-emerge if there is no proper reform of the EU's fiscal rules. And I will show that rather small technical changes could already have a large impact on the assessment of fiscal space for countries going forward. So if you think about the current reform debate, and several problems have been highlighted in terms of the framework we currently have, and I think we need to be clear that, well, we will not be able to achieve everything, and we need to set priorities. And I think the two main priorities of what we should achieve with the reform going forward is, first of all, to allow for more counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and that means that we also need to get rid of potential output estimates that are biased, especially because of large downward revisions in potential output during crises. And then I think we also should strive to allow governments and provide them with incentives to go for more public investment, in particular to address climate change. And I will say a little bit about how I think this could be done under given political constraints. So even if far-reaching changes to the fiscal rules were not feasible, and I think that is the base scenario we should be working with, we could tackle these two problems. First, by debating and improving output gap estimates, and second, by thinking about the adjustment requirements in terms of converging to the public debt to GDP target, basically reducing the requirements there, and then maybe also introducing a reformed investment clause that provides additional incentives for governments to increase public investment. So what are the problems with EU fiscal governance? I have tried to bring that into the debate already over the last couple of years, especially together with my colleagues and Twitter friends, Adam Tooze from Columbia University and Robin Brooks from the IIF. We called this the debate against nonsense output gaps on Twitter, and this has also been featured in some mainstream media already before the pandemic. For example, the Financial Times has also covered this a couple of times. And I will try to explain what this actually is about. So what I will present to you in a minute is basically based on a larger research project, which I started in 2015 already. And on the basis of which I wrote a set of papers and the results from which I tried to use to kind of also inform the debate on why some of the technical stuff in the EU's fiscal rules is politically so relevant, and why we need to, consider also this political content. So let me move to this question: what's wrong with fiscal governance in the EU? I think we need to acknowledge that like opaque technical aspects are of very high political relevance, and this has largely been, masked from public discourse. Why is that important? Let me start with one of the most prominent examples. When you think back to the year 2018, when there were, also again big public discussions over Italy, because the Commission communicated that it was thinking about starting an excessive deficit procedure against Italy. What was not, that prominent in the debate is that largely this conflict between the Italian government and the European Commission was about output gap estimates. So this was about the assessment where, the Italian economy at this point in time, and also looking forward 2 or 3 years, where it was in the business cycle and how much underutilization of economic resources there was. So basically, a European Commission argued that the structural fiscal deficit in Italy was too big, and therefore the Italian government should introduce further fiscal consolidation measures. And the Italian government argued that the European Commission's estimate of the output gap are basically flawed. So basically, where the output gap is a model-based estimate of slack in the economy. I will explain in a minute how they actually come to that. But this conflict was really about the output gap. Kind of the Commission argued that the Italian output gap was very narrow, actually non-existent. No slack in the Italian economy, and therefore also no room for fiscal policy to promote recovery or closing of this output gap without, running into the danger of overheating the economy. Whereas Italian authorities also brought forward a couple of alternative output gap estimates, arguing that actually there was more slack in the Italian economy, and therefore Italy was actually compliant with the EU's fiscal rules and would not have needed to introduce further cuts in government spending or tax increases. So that's what this conflict, was really about, and I will show to you why this conflict was mainly about this, because this is very relevant also in the guidelines the European Commission uses to interpret the Stability and Growth Pact. So this is really about the so-called structural fiscal balance in the EU fiscal regulation framework, where the basic idea is rather simple, right? So basic idea is that you have the headline fiscal balance between tax revenues and government spending. However, we know that obviously swings in the business cycle, ups and downs in economic activity have an impact on the business cycle. And in particular, during a recession, you will have a decrease in tax revenues and an increase in social spending, especially related to unemployment. And therefore, you should correct for the effects of the business cycle on government revenues and spending. And this is done, as I will show to you, based on this output gap model. So the idea is to correct the headline fiscal balance for the effects of the business cycle and also for budgetary one-off effects. And that's very relevant because in the Stability and Growth Pact, the medium-term budgetary objectives that need to be followed by governments are defined in terms of the structural fiscal deficit. And if there are deviations from this medium-term budgetary objective, this structural fiscal deficit must be corrected by 0.5% of GDP per year. And then you also have the expenditure benchmark, which also relates to estimates of unobservable potential output growth, which kind of stipulates that the growth of government spending should not be higher than medium-term potential output growth. So these model-based estimates are really important in the Stability and Growth Pact. And also you have the Fiscal Compact, which was introduced in 2013, and which stipulates an annual structural deficit limit of 0.5% of GDP, and which was codified in national law in many countries, even in terms of constitutional safeguard, for example, like in Germany, but also like, for example, in Italy. In other countries, it was just codified, as a simple law, but still the so-called debt breaks are part of national law. And there you also have limits on the structural deficit, which have to be followed in budget planning. And the point is that, when we are now at the juncture where we think about how to reform the fiscal rules, it makes sense to also reflect on how the fiscal rules have actually evolved. And when you do that, you, I think, have to acknowledge that these model-based fiscal targets have massively increased in importance, especially after the financial crisis, with several rounds of reform. So in particular with the six-pack reform in 2011, but then also with the introduction of the Fiscal Compact. And in 2015, as I will show to you, also with the introduction of the so-called flexibility guidelines by the European Commission, because there these output gap estimates, are directly linked to the fiscal adjustment effort that needs to be taken by a specific government. The point I want to make here is that, the evolution on the legal level can be also mapped onto the technical level, because, somehow you have to estimate these model-based fiscal targets. And for this, in Europe, we use the workhorse model by the European Commission, which I will talk about in a minute. Before I do that, let me show you a couple of quotes from interviews I conducted with colleagues, with people in Brussels, in the European Commission, but also representatives of member states, which are in political process working with these model-based fiscal targets. So this is a quote from an interviewee from the Economic Policy Committee, which is actually, politically in charge of making decisions on whether some of the model-based stuff should be changed or reformed. And this quote is that for economists, the structural fiscal deficit is understandable. So I told you before what the basic idea behind this is. So in the models of economists, this structural fiscal deficit is defined. But the problem is it's unobservable or unmeasurable in the real world. And therefore, you could make the argument that a lot of the political people out there also think that we are not really sure what we mean by the concept and what we actually measure. This is a quote from another interview we did where a representative of a member state in the output gaps working group in Brussels, where the experts of the European Commission come together with technical experts and representatives of member states to discuss this model, where this interview, we argued that there are both objective and subjective difficulties with calculating these structural fiscal deficits. And there is a general feeling in several member countries that actually the structural fiscal deficit is far too fragile to rely on. And the last quote I will show to you is basically from the European Commission itself. So this is from the document on the introduction of the review process, the governance review process, where the European Commission acknowledges that the current fiscal regulation framework relies heavily on variables that are not directly observable and, as I will show to you, are frequently revised. But there are large revisions, such as the output gap and the structural balance, and this hampers kind of the provision of stable policy guidance. Also increases the complexity of the framework we have and reduces transparency, especially of the preventive arm of the Stability and Growth Pact. So let me now talk about this model a little bit in detail before we move to the implications for fiscal policy in Belgium and some other countries over the last decade. So, at the core is the so-called potential output model by the European Commission, which is basically a neoclassical Cobb-Douglas production function, where potential output, which they define as the level of output an economy can reach when all factors of production are utilized at non-inflationary levels, where this is a function of the input factors labor, which is L here, capital K, and total factor productivity. And it's crucial to understand that the various inputs to potential output at the sub-level are estimated by using statistical filtering models. In particular, when it comes to the contribution of labor to potential output, the Commission estimates the so-called non-accelerating wage inflation rate of unemployment, which is based on, as I will show to you, statistically detrending the unemployment rate. And also when it comes to estimating total factor productivity based on the Solar residual, the Commission also uses a statistical filtering model. And these estimates of potential output, which are reached based on this model, then determine the estimates of the so-called output gap, which is simply the difference between actual GDP and this model-based estimate of potential output. And this directly enters the calculation of the structural fiscal balance, which is simply, when you subtract the cyclical component from the headline fiscal balance, where the cyclical component is estimated based on this output gap estimate and an elasticity parameter for how strongly the budget reacts to a change in the output gap. And the point is, this is important because when based on the model by the Commission, the estimate is that the output gap is pretty large. So you have underutilization of economic resources. This would mean that actually most of the headline fiscal deficit the country is running is due to cyclical factors and not due to structural factors, and therefore the structural fiscal deficit will appear small. Whereas when you only estimate a very small output gap, this would mean that most or all of the actual fiscal deficit is due to structural factors, and therefore the structural fiscal deficit will appear large. And the point is that estimating potential output and its subcomponents in real time is like a really difficult, as economists have known already well before the Commission started building and using its own model. But there are specific difficulties with regard to the estimates that are produced by the European Commission. Let me give you the intuition here by talking a little bit about estimates by the Commission for Italy concerning the non-accelerating wage inflation rate of unemployment. So the intuition here is, if the Commission estimates a higher non-accelerating wage inflation rate of unemployment, this would mean that the contribution of the production factor labor to potential output is lower, and therefore you would have a downward revision in potential output, which would make the output gap basically shrink. And so what you can see here is estimates at different points in time. So you can see, if you look at the blue line here, that the Commission's estimates for the NAVRU were actually on the decline before the financial crisis. So that's the estimate from autumn 2007. However, then we know that, you know, the financial crisis hit, and this also had a big impact on the real economy, and that led to a pretty stark increase in actual unemployment. So you can see that, you know, this dotted orange line moves up a lot, and then you can see pretty drastic revisions in NAVRU estimates, which are used basically as a proxy for structural unemployment. So very stark upward revisions in the NAVRU. And, you know, also the path of the NAVRU, even before the financial crisis, looks very different now ex post based on the Commission's estimates. And the thing is that, you know, this is known in the statistical filtering literature as the so-called endpoint bias. So this means that, you know, the last points of data that you use in estimating this have a disproportionate impact on, you know, your trend estimates. And this is what you can see, especially for the countries that were hit hardest by the crisis. But it's certainly something like a general feature. So we have pro-cyclicality in these estimates, which means that especially during crisis times, you see an upward revision in what's structural about unemployment, although it's doubtful whether this can really be interpreted as an increase in structural unemployment. And correspondingly, you see a downward revision in potential output, based on the Commission's model, which is what I show you here for Italy. So the dotted black line is the estimate from autumn 2007, where you can basically see, you know, a continuous, also a trend growth, which was forecast to continue in 2008, 2009. And then after the crisis hit, you know, you see several stepwise downward revisions in potential output as these, you know, crisis data points entered model estimation. And you can see that even there was another downward revision after the COVID-19 crisis hit. That's, you know, the black line here compared to the potential output estimate before the crisis. If you look at this for Belgium, which is what I do on this slide, you see that there were, I would argue, substantial revisions, and I will talk more about this on one of the next slides. However, there were certainly much less stark than in Italy and Spain and some other countries, given that, you know, Belgium did not suffer such a deep recession, and, you know, economic developments were also smoother and better compared to some of the crisis countries. However, you can also see here, you know, some downward revisions in potential output in 2010 and 2012 and 2015. These are the green and the grayish lines here. And you can also see that then there were some upward revisions as the economy improved in autumn 2019. However, now with the COVID-19 crisis, that's the most recent estimate from autumn 2021, published 2 weeks ago, you see another, you know, downward revision. So I will now talk about, you know, what the literature actually has to say on this, the international literature. And I will here refer to something which Antonio Fataz, a professor of economics at INSEAD, calls self-fulfilling pessimism, or the fiscal policy doom loop in several European countries, which was most pronounced during the Euro crisis years. So what Fataz means by you know, self-fulfilling pessimism is that what you saw during the Euro crisis, and I just showed it to you with regard to the Italy estimates for potential output, is that, you know, when the crisis hit, you had an initial downward revision in potential output, and this arguably sent also the wrong signal for fiscal policymakers, which is that, you know, the structural fiscal deficit appears large, therefore you should tighten fiscal policy more during the crisis, during the recession. So this kind of promotes also or gives a pro-cyclical signal to fiscal policymakers. Large structural deficits then increase the fiscal consolidation pressure because of the importance of the structural fiscal deficit as a control indicator in the EU's fiscal rules. And then fiscal consolidation at the wrong time reduces economic growth and employment, given that fiscal multipliers are higher during recessions. And this then leads to further procyclical downward revisions in potential output due to the endpoint bias of the filtering procedures that are used by the Commission with regard to the NAVRO, but also total factor productivity, which I showed to you also before. And this kind of, at least partly verifies the initial downward revision in potential output. But it was kind of a vicious cycle for some countries, especially those that were hardest hit by the recession after the financial crisis. And the thing is that, the problem is that these fiscal policy mistakes that you initially make when you estimate the output gap to be very large due to be very small due to downward revisions in potential output, these mistakes are magnified over time, and they end up leaving permanent economic scars. So in principle, fiscal policy planning based on estimating potential output and the output gap should make budgets sustainable. However, given that there are or can be significant long-term effects of pro-cyclical fiscal policy, especially when you do it during a recession or in the immediate aftermath of a recession, as it again pushes up unemployment and thereby also leaves scars in the labor market, the end result may actually be a higher public debt to GDP ratio than you would have had without having potential output estimates send the wrong signal to fiscal policymakers. That's a point that has been made by Fatas and Larry Summers in the paper in 2018. And the thing is that you need to recognize when you look at the relevant numbers in Europe that there are systematic problems here. So on this chart, I show you basically the correlation between the loss in actual output of European economies compared to the pre-crisis growth trend. So the loss in actual GDP, and on the vertical axis, you have the loss in potential output. And what you can see there is that the correlation is almost perfect. So the countries with the highest actual output losses also suffered the largest potential output revisions on the downside. I, also highlighted Belgium here, where you can see that, Belgium is also basically on this regression line, but has been affected, much less than some other countries, but still I would say is here in the middle of the pack. So this is like a systematic problem. So kind of by producing these estimates, this pro-cyclical bias is inherent. So let me now talk a little bit about what this means in the Belgian context. So current official estimates by the European Commission, as I already hinted at in the beginning, don't see an output gap for Belgium, which means that actual output is, basically at potential output. This is the official estimate here, which you can see by looking at the orange line. You can also see that there was some downward revision during the COVID-19 crisis when you compare the orange line to the black line. However, it makes sense to also think about what the output gap would look like if you were just to compare it with an extrapolation of the potential output growth rates that were estimated by the Commission in the 10 years that preceded the financial crisis. So potential output growth rates were about 2.1% annually. And if you were to extrapolate this, you would get a much larger output gap, obviously, than the official estimate says. So the output gap would be about 13% in 2023. Now, many economists will argue, okay, it doesn't make sense to think that there was no downward revision in potential output at all in response to the crisis. Potential growth must have been lower, given that some economic sectors were hit, and also productivity growth may have been hit. So even if you were to acknowledge that there was a substantial decrease in potential growth with hysteresis effects, which reduced potential growth by 0.7 percentage points, even then you would get a much larger official or alternative output gap estimate for 2023 of 4% for Belgium. And why does this matter? Well, it matters a lot in terms of your assessment of what's structural about the fiscal balance in Belgium. So here I show you some calculations with different output gap estimates. The grayish bars are the official Commission estimates. So you can see that basically in 2022, the structural fiscal deficit is estimated to be close to 5% of potential output. If you were to use different output gap estimates, where the orange one is the hysteresis scenario and the green one is the one where you simply extrapolate the pre-financial crisis growth rates in potential output, then you get actually a picture where either the structural fiscal deficit is much smaller, as in the hysteresis scenario, or even already in surplus, as in the pre-financial crisis scenario. So these technical details matter a lot in how you actually assess, the structural fiscal deficit, and therefore it makes a lot of difference in terms of guidance, whether governments reach their medium-term budgetary objectives. And this is very, very relevant because, in 2015, the European Commission introduced the so-called flexibility guidelines, which was basically an attempt to respond to some of the criticisms with regard to the framework and the reforms after the financial crisis. And where the Commission wanted to introduce a little bit more flexibility for member states, and where they said, okay, if the economic situation is bad in a country, and we will assess that by looking at the output gap, whether the economic situation is bad, then we will reduce the fiscal adjustment effort in the preventive arm of the Stability and Growth Pact. So that's basically what this matrix tells you. So if the output gap is estimated to be, non-existent or very small, you have a large fiscal adjustment need. So governments need to have an improvement in the structural fiscal balance of 0.5% of GDP annually, or even more, depending on whether they are above or below 60% debt to GDP. But if the output gap is estimated to be larger than 3 or even larger than -4, then this would mean that no adjustment would actually be needed. And that was also the reason, coming back to what I showed you in the beginning, why there was this conflict between the Italian government and the European Commission, which was largely about the estimate of the output gap, because the Italian government said, hey, the output gap currently is, even larger than 4% of GDP, and therefore we should not have to go for any additional fiscal adjustment. Whereas the Commission said, no output gap, sorry, cut more. So as we see, these technical this technical stuff in terms of how you estimate the output gap and the structural fiscal deficit, has a very big impact on assessing also the fiscal space governments have in the existing framework. It's interesting to note that ECB President Lagarde last year in a speech directly acknowledged misestimations of output gaps in Europe. However, she did not discuss the major implications for fiscal policy, obviously. So she said in the speech that revisions to potential output mistook cyclical changes for structural trend. It's also kind of the argument that I made before. And she says that research supports a role for hidden slack, for hidden economic slack, more underutilization of economic resources than official output gap estimates suggest. Since 2011, she says, studies that assume that the output gap has been much larger have in general outperformed those that use traditional estimates. Okay, let me now quickly move to the last part of my presentation, which is about, okay, given this criticism that I have tried to advance, or that I've tried to explain here, what do we do about this? How can we actually come up with improvements that are also, you know, politically feasible? I think the first step is, and this is very important for the public debate, to acknowledge that, you know, the fiscal framework as it currently stands assigns a lot of power to those that estimate potential output, and correspondingly the output gap and structural fiscal balances. This is also a quote which I take from an interview with a national representative in the output gaps working group, but I think it's important to stress this also for the public debate, given that obviously, you know, many of technical stuff in the background is difficult to communicate and to understand for non-specialists, but we need to stress the point how politically relevant the technical details are. So that's why I have also tried to promote this public debate. I think it's necessary to acknowledge that opaque technical details are very important for EU fiscal governance, and this plays very much a role if you think about the future of fiscal policy in Belgium and Europe as well. So we can pose the question, should democratic economic policy making even depend so heavily on such highly revision prone and in the end rather opaque model estimates? So that's a discussion we can have. However, if political conditions do not yet allow us to develop a new framework that does not rely on these estimates, then we must ask at least the question, how can the underlying model estimates be improved? And let me say in the end a little bit about this, because actually, I mean, we will see what the details in the German coalition treaty actually are, but I'm in close touch with some of the people which have worked on the proposal that I will present in a minute, and it could be that a door will be opened in the German coalition treaty in terms of you know, changing the underlying estimation of potential output and output gaps. First in the debt brake context in Germany, but potentially also in the European context, because this seems to be something that from a political point of view is easier to swallow for some of the other political players than other proposals. Anyway, we'll see what's in the German coalition treaty. Let me now talk a little bit about what this proposal is actually about. So this is from the think tank Die Zukunft, which is based in Berlin, and they have, you know, published a couple of months ago. It is also available in English, and I link to it here. They have published a report where they kind of propose, well, in the existing model framework used by the European Commission, how can we come up with, you know, politically more plausible, macroeconomically more plausible estimates. So they propose basically sticking with the existing potential output approach, but introducing technical twists that could potentially provide a lot more fiscal space, not only for Germany, but also for Belgium and other countries. The first thing they do is they replace the NAVRU, which is used as a proxy for structural unemployment in estimating potential output. They replace this with a full employment target. And then, you know, they have two other modifications where basically they also say that there are you know, political targets which, you know, in terms of female labor participation, which would lead you to revise the labor force participation rates that enters the potential output calculations. And then in addition, you know, you have, you know, quite a bit of involuntary unemployment. And this means that, you know, there could be substantially more working hours, which could also affect the calculation of the production factor labor in calculating potential output. And so they do a couple of modifications there, and they find that actually the cyclical fiscal deficit component In Germany is much bigger when you do that, which means that correspondingly the structural fiscal deficit currently, but also in the years ahead, appears much smaller. And they show that this could yield up to 20 billion euros in additional fiscal space for Germany up to 2024. So let me finish by presenting some estimates based on their proposal for Belgium. So as I already showed you in the beginning, official estimates currently are that the output gap is non-existent, is very close to zero. That's also part of the Belgian stability program that was submitted to the European Commission in October this year. Therefore, the structural fiscal deficit appears large. Now, to show you how, some relatively minor technical tweaks have a pretty big impact on assessing the output gap and the structural fiscal balance. The first thing I did is to replace Navarro estimates by a full employment target, where you find that the output gap is immediately much larger at about 5% of a potential output, and this directly also changes the assessment of the structural fiscal deficit, which is only about half of the current official estimate, and when you then even also add additional working hours, then you get an even larger output gap of about 8.5% of potential output, which would even show that in 2022 the structural fiscal balance in Belgium is already in surplus. So just to illustrate, how important the technical stuff here also is, because this will obviously, if we are to reintroduce the fiscal rules in 2023, have a very big impact in terms of what the Belgian government can do in terms of extra spending programs. So I think this is now the time to seriously discuss pros and cons of different reform options. I heard that Brochard was already here, so I guess he presented, his proposal for fiscal standards. That's what I would say is one of the most ambitious reform proposals. And from a political point of view, it's rather difficult to see how that should materialize with this current reform round. But then there are also more pragmatic proposals out there, which could provide more fiscal space for governments, and which would arguably be politically easier to decide on. In particular, improving the calculation of the structural fiscal deficit, as I discussed, making it less procyclical, and then also replacing the debt reduction rule in the current fiscal rules with a smaller reduction requirement. I will show you on the next slide why this matters also a lot for Belgium. And then something that could also be done is to change the investment clause by incentivizing national investment and reforms, incentivizing more public investment in principle, and tie this to targets that can be scrutinized and policed a little bit based on the role model of the RRF, because I guess this is something that could also be politically a road to compromise. So let me finish with this. I mean, if you look at public debt to GDP for Belgium here, which is the orange line, and you probably know this much better than I do, we know that Belgian public debt to GDP was, among the highest in Europe in the 1990s, and Belgium ran pretty high primary fiscal surpluses. So basically, when you exclude interest payments from the headline fiscal balance, which is the black line here, you see that there were pretty large primary fiscal surpluses in the 1990s and early 2000s. And now in the COVID-19 crisis, you see very large primary fiscal deficits driven by the crisis and the response to the crisis. And you see also pretty stark increase again in public debt to GDP. If we are now simply to reinstate the fiscal framework that we currently have, this would mean that Belgium would need to run substantial primary fiscal surpluses, not only for the next couple of years, but probably for the next 2 decades, to bring down, public debt to GDP towards the target of 60%. And given the problems related to estimating the output gap, you could also not expect a lot of flexibility if we really were to look at enforcing the fiscal rules that we currently have starting in 2023 already. And that's why I think we should use this window of opportunity now to discuss, whether going back to the rules, to the status quo of the rules actually makes sense. We should think, in depth also about some of the technical problems that are, I would argue, pretty apparent if you dig a little bit deeper and try to tackle that. So thanks for your attention, and looking forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Donc it's possible to ask some question in the chat, and we have a question of Olivier Loest. Donc I'm reading the question. Thank you for the presentation. What is the implication of this new approach concerning the estimation of potential output on the expenditure benchmark, also based on potential input? And what is the potential impact of that criteria?
Okay, thank you for the question. So you're referring to the expenditure benchmark, which basically is an additional clause which says that you look at medium-term potential output growth, so basically the growth rate in potential output over a multi-year window, and then you say that basically expenditure growth of a particular country should not be higher than this medium-term potential output growth. So basically, these unobservable variable of estimating potential output also plays a role here. However, it's important to note that these estimates, these problems with regard to the procyclicality in estimating potential output are not that severe when you look at potential output growth rates compared to when you look at level estimates of potential output. However, I'm not sure whether I have some data here. I could show that to you as well if I find that. But what you basically see, I talked about the example of Italy. You see that after the financial crisis, potential output growth rates were also massively revised downwards. So basically, the official estimate suggested that potential output growth was actually negative over a period of several years. So this would obviously also mean that if you were to apply the expenditure benchmark, that the expenditure growth would be very limited if you have very low or even negative potential output growth rate. Now, what would change with the proposal that I showed to you here by Dezernat Zukunft? Well, you would have somewhat higher potential output growth rates. As far as I know, they're currently working on also applying their proposal to all other EU countries. Currently, so far they have focused mostly on Germany, but this would only show higher potential output growth rates, and this would also give more flexibility when you are thinking about expenditure benchmarks.
Thank you. And Olivier asked you another question about the using of the Kalman filter in your approach. What is about the border bias effect of the Kalman filter?
Sorry, what kind of bias?
A bias about your using Kalman filter.
So I should kind of explain again what this bias is about. Do I understand you correctly? The Kalman filter refers to estimation of, first of all, the non-accelerating wage inflation rate of unemployment, estimates that I showed you in particular for Italy, but this is obviously also done for Belgium and all other countries. So they use kind of a multivariate statistical filtering model where you also have a Phillips curve type relationship in the background, where unemployment is related to wage inflation, and the thing is, that this is a recursive process. And so data is fed into this statistical filtering model. And the bias that I was referring to is the so-called endpoint bias, as it is called in the scientific literature. And the endpoint bias basically means that the endpoints in the data sample have a disproportionate impact on your estimate of the trend. So basically what you do with this Kalman filter model is you estimate the trend component of the unemployment rate. So you kind of try to distinguish the cycle from the trend, and you do that by applying the statistical filtering model. However, the problem is that this is not easy to distinguish, and you may end up with a problem where, when you have a pretty steep crisis, meaning that, unemployment, actual unemployment shoots up, then, these couple of endpoints in your data sample may actually have a disproportionate impact on your estimate of the trend component in unemployment. And that's why you see arguably also very large revisions and shifts in the trend estimate when you have a big crisis in several European countries. This bias is in principle very well known, but it's difficult to avoid. And some of the economists at the European Commission are also aware of this. The thing is, given how the model is constructed, it's very difficult to avoid given some of the assumptions in the background.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Another question, Renat Hansen asked you a question. I have a question on the solution proposed, which don't reduce complexity of the model, but play foremost on the parameters used.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
That is a very good point. And I told you that I think there should also be an open space in the current debate where we ask the question, do we even want to make fiscal policy and assessment of fiscal policy dependent on such model estimates which are prone to revision? From a democratic point of view, you could argue that this is a big problem, because I would say that even the finance ministers in European countries do not know very well how these model estimates actually work and what the problems attached to this are. This is something that can in detail at best be understood by like the experts who have worked on this probably for months or years. However, the question is, if you really want to change something in fiscal policy in Europe, you can come up obviously also with blue sky proposals, and that's important, also to be visionary and to show how alternative frameworks could look like. For example, the fiscal standards that have been proposed by Blojar, Settelmeier, and Leandro. However, it's from a pragmatic point of view very unlikely that anything like this will fly, given that we don't have any consensus on how to move forward, or very different opinions currently. And so I think showing what the problems with some of the technical stuff currently are, and then coming up with some feasible improvements or solutions that could relatively easily be put into practice has some merit. And that's what the proposal that I have presented tries to do. So basically, they argue that their proposal does not address some of the more fundamental flaws with the fiscal rules. It is more intended as a pragmatic first step towards a more democratic, coherent, and sustainable fiscal policy. Basically, what they do is, as I already said, take the current framework and then do 3 modifications. The first modification is to go from estimating the NAVRU to a full employment target, where basically what they do is to proxy for full employment by adjusting the unemployment rate for the share of long-term unemployed. So basically the argument is that you have still short-term frictional unemployment. This will always exist. However, the notion that there are people actively looking for employment that have registered for, the Federal Employment Agency or so, is not reconcilable with the concept of full capacity utilization. And compared to the NAVRU, it is closer to the politically declared goal of full employment when you use this proxy for full employment, as they do. Then the second modification is that they say, well, there is, political targets in terms of female labor force participation, and by replacing the statistical extrapolation of labor force participation as it is currently used with gender-specific participation rates, they come up with the second modification. And then the third modification is that they argue that one should strive to eliminate involuntary and non-essential part-time work. And that's why they make the case for Germany, but also for some other countries, that this would lead, to a higher potential in terms of working hours in the economy if you were to eliminate this involuntary part-time work. And this gives you a higher contribution of production factor labor to potential output. So basically, that's what they do. And obviously, there are also other proposals out there. I mean, several technical proposals on how to differently estimate potential output. I think what's good about their proposal is, and some economists don't like that, but I think that's actually the right thing. We need to acknowledge, how politically fraught the estimates that we had over the last 10 years, how political they have been. Actually, if you look at the history of these model-based estimates, you see that the Spanish government, but also the Italian government, the Finnish government, but also governments in Luxembourg, etc. Behind the scenes, they have voiced criticism with regard to the estimates that have been produced for their countries. And in 2013, 2014, this even led to some adjustments in how some of the subcomponents are being estimated. However, the problem is that, this is basically only happening behind closed doors between experts, whereas, I think we should have a discussion of how we actually want to define potential output, and then also how we can come up with an estimation approach that kind of meets this from a political point of view. And that's why I think their proposal is interesting. I link to this proposal also in the slides that I provide, and you can look at it in detail. I think what's also very good about their document is they have like a very detailed critique of the existing model that is used by the European Commission, where they kind of show that contrary to the legal requirement, it does not really take into account the latest social scientific research, in particular with regard to the filtering techniques that are being used, and it relies basically on an arbitrary notion of the normal level of economic activity. And as a result, it also delegates too much discretion to civil servants, who are basically insufficiently legitimized to exercise this discretion. So they argue that it kind of also no longer corresponds to the original intention of the legislators. And what's also interesting is they have produced basically a legal opinion for their proposal, whether it could actually be implemented in the German context. And this legal opinion was actually positive, which is a big thing, because the lawyers will very rapidly tell you, okay, I get the economic kind of criticism, but we can't do that. We can't change, the way we look at normal factor utilization in the economy, because the law says it has to be like this or like that. So it's just something I want to put out there, and which I think can also enrich the discussion. And it might also be interesting to look at this from a Belgian perspective, given that I think they also intend to work on this. Or to show what their proposal would mean for other European countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Another question of Renat. He says the proposed unemployment figures to be used in a better estimate for Belgium seems, by the way, not realistic. And he asked to explain orally, so perhaps Nassima, tu pourrais donner la parole à Renat?
C'est fait.
Okay, Renat?
Okay, thank you. Let me say just in the beginning that we are really fond of your analysis, and we really appreciate all the criticism, which is very to the point and will help us as trade. I'm from the Belgian trade union CSC, will help the whole trade union movement, but let's hope other civil society organizations as well to criticize and give better proposals in the actual consultation. So that's for sure very appreciated. But then I already posted the criticism that we stay in the same model with all the problems that it has. But your point is that from a pragmatic point of view, yes, there's no big chance that lots of things will change. And then I come to my point here for the balance figures you showed that by using the target for full employment, that directly the output gap estimate is completely different. But this is for me not very much giving hope, because yes, we have very high participation targets in the labor market, and as trade unions we applaud to the government that they put forward these figures. But let's be realistic. At this point, the Belgian labor market, especially in Flanders, is it's very tense. So saying that there's a potential for more employment up to 4%, or I don't know what it would be if you use the official objectives. Good, but that's not really realistic to use in a model to estimate the potential output for Belgium. But that's for Belgium, because for other countries and in the past you showed very clear that this is really very problematic. And so on the procyclicality analysis, of course, we support fully the analysis. But then my conclusion would be, yes, for Belgium, let's go for more radical change, and more radical change is the anchor of the whole fiscal policy should be debt sustainability, and this is a largely spread and agreed analysis, and this so the 60% figure is very problematic, but as if it wouldn't be changed, but the debt reduction path would be changed drastically. That are for me the major changes that we need, because this is the major problem for Belgium, that we have a high debt, and a high debt not compared to other debt levels of advanced economies, if you only refer to Japan and the United States. But so the 60% level is completely arbitrary, everybody knows. So we must, as trade unions, I'm aware that we must continue to lobby on saying this debt level we never accepted, and Belgian politics, as a matter of fact, don't accept it already. So I sometimes say we must change the rules by rebellion, and Belgian politicians do this. So far for the debt target. But my point was we need other changes for Belgium. The proposal is very worthwhile, but I don't think for Belgium it will help us. So we need a very more realistic debt reduction path and debt levels, or ideas on debt sustainability that radically differ from the actual ones.
Thank you. Can I respond?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So thanks for your intervention or your response. I mean, just to be clear, I also mentioned at the end of my presentation that I don't think that changing the way we calculate output gaps and structural deficits is actually sufficient in moving forward. I also mentioned that for Belgium, but also for other countries with especially high debt to GDP ratios, it's also very important to think about the debt reduction path and the debt reduction goal. And I would agree with you that it should be out of the question that we should strictly enforce this. would not make sense and would even be counterproductive. I mean, we know that from also the Euro crisis episode. You know, I mean, you can tell governments that they need to, you know, do more consolidation, but when they go for it, you know, and it chokes economic recovery, you may end up in the end actually with a higher debt to GDP ratio than what you would have had otherwise. So even if governments are to run substantial primary fiscal surpluses, this does not guarantee by itself, if growth rates are you know, pushed down, that debt to GDP ratios will really move fast towards the target as we currently have it. And I mean, you're in good company in terms of arguing for rethinking the 60% debt target. If you think about the proposals by the European Stability Mechanism and the ESM, published a couple of weeks ago, where ESM Director Regling, who was one of the key architects of the current EU fiscal rules, also says that basically going back to the 60% target doesn't make sense. Then you know, you are in pretty good company. However, obviously the political hurdles to changing the 60% target are high, and much higher than some of the stuff that I talked about in terms of you know, changing the debt reduction path, changing the investment clause, and changing the output gap calculations. Therefore, you know, I think one should not only focus on the 60% debt target. Also, given that in the preventive arm of the Stability and Growth Pact, as I showed, currently these model-based estimates that I was talking about are essential. Last point with regard to your response. I mean, I get your general criticism that you know, the question is what is full employment? How do you actually operationalize this? You know, the proposal that I presented here has a very detailed analysis for Germany, how they actually come up with the full employment target for Germany. I think this is something that should also then be done for other countries, including Belgium. However, the question is, you know, I think you always have regional labor markets which may be pretty tight. However, when I look at the Belgium unemployment rate and how it has evolved over the last 10 years, and also, you know, employment ratios, I would argue that it's relatively implausible that there is no slack in the labor market overall. I mean, I'm not an expert on the Belgium labor market, and I'm happy to acknowledge this, but still, I think it's also politically useful to you know, argue whether fiscal policy should be reoriented more towards reaching full employment. I think that's also something that is linked to the debt sustainability concept that you were talking about. I mean, I think one of the problems that we often have is that we talk about debt sustainability as if it were detached to some of the other stuff that are happening on the macroeconomic level. It's very difficult to think about how you want to ensure debt sustainability if you have you know, pretty high unemployment rates over a prolonged period of time, because that will also put pressure on the budget in several areas. So conceptually, it makes sense to link fiscal policy more strongly with full employment. And the question is, how do you then actually put it into practice? And you know, the proposal that I was talking about is a pragmatic proposal in terms of making a first step towards achieving this. But you know, I think it should be seen as an input to the discussion, and something which could also spark a debate in individual countries on well, how far are we actually away from full employment, and what does that mean for different groups in the labor market, and so on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. There is other question.
There is one more question. I don't understand it entirely, but I will read from Nancy Powell's. Is there a possibility to bring in this debt sustainability output gap discussion and debt sustainability discussion an opening to current close the tax gap discussion? Estimate of Zuckman. Linking estimating the tax gap of tax revenue losses due to tax avoidance, evasion, etc. Which indicators of close the tax gap discussion, Murphy discussion, tax avoidance, evasion, minimal corporate taxes of 15%, 20%. You know what she is referring to?
Well, let me try to say something on this. I think what the question is referring to is the work by Gabriel Zuckman and co-authors who have for the European Union provided estimates in terms of how much tax revenues are lost due to tax competition between states and tax avoidance by multinational companies. So basically this discussion in Europe that we have obviously a couple of member states like in particular Ireland, but also countries like the Netherlands or Luxembourg, which kind of use a tax code in terms of their business model, which is supposed to attract, multinational companies, bringing in additional tax revenues for them with, lower tax rates offered to the multinationals, but leading to losses in tax revenues for others. So I think that's what referred to in terms of the tax gap. I would say there is no direct relation to the output gap discussion. Both refer to a gap. But I mean, from a political point of view, you could try to put that into perspective. I mean, if we think about the discussions last year, for example, over Next Generation EU, this was also at least mentioned in the debates when, in particular, the Netherlands had a relatively hard stance vis-a-vis Italy and some other countries, because they argued that there should should not be more fiscal space for these countries going forward, and in particular that there should be fewer grants from the EU side. And part of this discussion was then also that you also have a problem in Italy, but also in France and other countries, that they lose billions of euros each year in terms of tax revenues to a couple of EU countries because of this race to the bottom in EU tax policy. And obviously, from a political point of view, you can ask the question whether that's actually sustainable and how that relates to also the evolution of public finances in these countries. Because if you have, a downfall, or you could also call it a tax gap each and every year, that obviously also makes it more difficult to reduce the fiscal deficit or even to run fiscal surpluses.
Thank you very much. A last question?
Je vois pas d'autres questions.
But thank you very much for your presentation and the debate. Very, very interesting. Maybe it's possible to keep in contact.
Sure.
And because the objective is to write a report for the Commission, a report of the social partner in Belgium, and with all the conference, all the debate, to propose some modification of the fiscal framework, European fiscal framework, and we will send to you maybe the report, and you are free to do some suggestion. Sure.
Sure, happy to do that. Many thanks for the invitation, and yeah, let's keep in touch.
thank you very much, and see you a good afternoon.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.